Hi, everyone. I'm attorney Donna DiMaggio Berger, and this is Take It to the Board, where we speak condo and HOA. When a dog bites a man, that is not news. But when a man bites a dog, that is news. This saying has been credited to several different real-life newspaper people, but most experts now believe that saying was spoken by a fictional character named Billy Woods. Do condo and HOA battles make the news? Actually, they do, and fairly frequently. At some point, many community associations become embroiled in a legal battle, and some of those battles, particularly when a significant loss, claim, or demand is involved, may be worthy of public attention. At that point, one or both parties may contact the media, or the media may learn of the issue independently. What is the best way to handle the glare of media attention? Today, I'm going to be speaking with Laura Guitar about the media and particularly how news coverage can impact private residential communities, management companies, and other vendors who work with community associations. Laura is the president of the Reputation and the Risk Advisors Division of RBB Communications, a marketing communications firm. Laura and her team focus on crisis preparedness planning, issue-oriented campaigns, litigation communications, and programs to mitigate reputational risk. Laura, welcome to Take It to the Board.
Thanks so much for having me. This is fantastic.
Well, I want to start out and just have you explain to our listeners, how did you get started on this career path? It's a real niche practice.
It is. I started actually when I was 16. I was a little bit of a handful as a teenager. And so to keep me out of trouble one summer, my mother convinced a friend of hers who had a public relations agency to take me on and keep me busy. And I fell in love with the business then. And so, kept building on internships and opportunities and have loved it the entire time.
I love it when I have people who know early on what their career path is going to be. I mean, I say this, but I knew at 13 I was going to law school. I don't know if it was a family member who said, you're very argumentative, you should go to law school, but I knew early on. So generally speaking, who are your clients and why do they need your services, Laura?
So our clients range from very large international corporations where we work with executive teams on moments of corporate risk or corporate inflection. We do a lot of merger and acquisitions work. We do a lot of transition planning at the executive level. And then it ranges all the way down to small businesses that may be having an issue that's just a momentary situation and they just need some help and guidance. We also work with individuals. We work with nonprofits. It's across the spectrum as to who may need help dealing with media around a particular good news situation or a particular bad news situation. It can go both ways.
Do your clients typically use you time and again? Like, do they have you on retainer so they know they can call you when they need you? Or do you have more people where it's a one-off situation?
Yeah, so we work a few ways. One is against a retainer, in which case there's typically a monthly fee that covers a certain number of hours, and we work with the client to determine, what we're going to do with those hours in terms of media relations, writing, publicity, those sorts of things. We also have clients that come in that are one-time project fees. So we need you to do X, and when it's over, we're finished. And then we have clients who are sort of reoccurring. They come around seasonally or on an as-needed basis. They know they need us more than once, but they don't need us all the time.
Gotcha. So the podcast is Take It to the Board. So our listeners are typically volunteer board members. This could be association residents. We have a lot of vendors in the industry who listen to the podcast, management companies, accounting firms, engineering firms. When it comes to media stories, a lot of these people, it's the first time they've ever been contacted by a member of the media for a comment on a story. What would be the first steps a person should take, whether it's volunteer board member or the manager? Let's take a board member or a manager, okay? Member of the media, reporter reaches out, contacts them either by email or phone call. What do they do?
Typically, what you want to have in place before that happens is a process to decide how those calls are handled. So, for example, with a property management company, they would have a protocol that says, if you get a call from a member of the media, you escalate it to this individual or you contact this person. Within a board, you may have a protocol by which you go to the board chair or you go to the executive committee to say, hey, I got this call. Let's decide how to respond. I think one of the things that's important to know is that you don't have to respond. There's not an obligation. And I think it's important at the outset to really think it through and say, should I respond? Do I need to respond? It's also important to know you probably have some time. Reporters very rarely call and are on an absolute hard and fast deadline in that moment. Now, you may not have a lot of time. It may be, a couple of hours, but it may be as long as a couple of days. So I think rather than just immediately respond, it's important to take that step back and think, do I need to respond? And then the first question we typically ask reporters when we're working with them is, when do you need a response? So we know how much time we have to consider the way we move forward.
So, Laura, I don't think I'm going out on a limb here to say that most associations probably don't have that protocol because they're not expecting to ever be contacted by a member of the media. I'm hoping that our vendors who are listening, that they implement that protocol. My advice to clients is always contact the attorney. Let us know if you've been contacted by a member of the media. Normally, we know when a dispute is going on. Sometimes we don't, but normally we know. Sometimes we have advance notice. Often we do not. But you mentioned one thing I want to follow up on. You said sometimes you don't have to respond. Is there a negative perception, though, if the story comes out and it's that, typical line, so-and-so was contacted for comment and declined to comment? Is there a negative perception associated with not commenting?
It depends. In situations where you have a side of the story, where you are concerned that there's information that may not be included in the coverage, but for commentary, it's probably a good idea to provide the reporter with that information. However, if you're pretty confident that all of the facts are going to be covered and you really don't have anything to add, or you don't have anything to say that's substantive, at that point, you're just giving the reporter more content to build a bigger story. There is something in the industry that's called starving the story. And I've actually seen negative stories never be published because we chose to starve the story. And that means we're just not providing any content. We're not providing commentary. There's no video available. There's just not enough to build a story. And so when you're thinking about not providing commentary, it's also important to consider, if I don't comment, does this reporter likely have enough to run the story or not? And if not, and you don't want the story to run, then you would certainly not comment. But I think people in today's age are very used to seeing so-and-so didn't provide a comment, or, this party said they had nothing to add, or no comment at this time. The other thing you can do in today's world, which is interesting in this digital universe we live in, is you can provide commentary after the fact, which wasn't an option available for a long time. So if the story runs and you chose not to provide commentary, and when you see the article, you think, gosh, I now know what I would have liked to say, or I really feel like our side is not represented, you could always go back after the fact and ask the reporter to update the digital story with your comment. And really, that's where the story lives. So we sometimes take the risk of not providing commentary with the knowledge that if we want to do it after the fact, that's generally an option.
Is another way, Laura, to do it after the fact, and I kind of know what you're going to say to me, is what if you tweeted out the story and said, this is where the reporter got this wrong? Do you run a risk with doing it that way?
Well, you run a risk of annoying the reporter, right? Most reporters want to be right. Despite popular opinion, they really are trying to get the story right. So if they reached out and in good faith tried to get the facts right, and by not providing commentary, we allowed them to get something wrong, it's going to irritate them. But it's certainly an option. I would suggest that using social platforms is very effective, but we always want the digital record to be as accurate as possible. So we're always going back to that original story as it's posted online, because it not only lives in perpetuity, often these stories get picked up by aggregators. So if it's wrong in one place, it ends up being wrong in 35 other places. And so we really pay close attention to that originating story to try and make sure it's as accurate as possible.
If you do it after the fact, I assume that you're also drawing attention to potentially negative story time and again. You're breathing more life into it. So listen, this is your job. You know how to talk to reporters. You know how to ask what's your deadline. But for the average person who's not sophisticated in this realm, how does he or she avoid being misquoted in a story?
Yeah, I think one of the best ways, and we use this all the time, is to correspond with the reporter over email. And it's very fair to say, hey, can you send me your questions via email? I'll get back to you. And that way, there's a clear record. Nobody's misunderstanding. There's no, suggestion that, you said something you didn't. You've got the record. And it also gives you time to get input from lots of people on the responses. It gives you time to think about the responses. And we use it a lot to make sure that people don't misspeak. The challenge in talking with a reporter online, particularly one that's good, is you may start with one question that leads to a whole bunch of others that you're not prepared to answer. That typically doesn't happen in email as easily, and you don't get as caught up as quickly. So email is a good way to sort of manage that process if you are going to respond.
Well, let's talk about the challenges of doing an interview live on TV.
It's a challenge.
I mean, at that point, all bets are off. And again, if you're dealing with somebody, this may be their very first television interview, it's intimidating. What would be your advice in that situation where the only story is going to be a live TV story?
We recommend to clients that they do live TV, what we call stand-ups. So an interview where you're standing outside somewhere, you're standing and the reporter's there with the camera sort of up in your face. Typically, we reserve those for good news stories. And again, it goes back to starving the story. If it's negative news, unless you have a very, very capable spokesperson, we generally suggest to clients that they use a written statement. If they're going to respond. Now, if for some reason you decide that it's a great idea to do this stand-up and you're going to be on camera, the biggest tip is to remember that the sound bites are really short. Sound bites on broadcast have gone from something like 25 seconds in the 60s and 70s to less than 7 seconds now. So you've got to speak in these very choppy sentences that feel unnatural, but make sure that your commentary doesn't get cut in the wrong place, because you want to get your points across. And you want to go into that knowing exactly the point you're going to make and then make it over and over and over again. And again, it's a very unnatural feeling thing. It's not conversational. It's not like you and I chatting right now, but you don't want it to be, because you want the reporter to have to use the message you give, not some other piece of extemporaneous commentary.
So I've heard from people that they feel that stories are written before they're actually told. Okay, that the reporter may have in his or her mind the way this story is going to roll out, and then they're going to edit it in a way that fits that narrative. Is that an accurate perception?
Yes, in some cases it is. Reporters are talking to their editors and others about what kinds of stories they're going to cover. Yes, breaking news, but there's not enough breaking news necessarily to fill every publication or media outlet every day. So they're looking ahead and saying, what do we think our readers are interested in? There's a few things that are important to know about this that have shifted in the media landscape, over the past few years. And that is the fact that reporters are now judged on the digital performance of their stories. So when reporters write a story, whether they're print or broadcast, radio, doesn't matter, the number of clicks that story receives online is a big part of how the media outlet determines whether or not that is a successful article. And in many outlets, reporters are financially incentivized for stories that get more clicks. The bad news about that is sociological studies have proven that negative headlines and negative stories get more clicks than positive. So by human nature, because we're all clicking on the negative, the scandalous, the salacious when we're online, that's what the media is feeding back to us. So a lot of time the media is looking for that negative angle. They are pulling out what's the most scandalous aspect of this, story or this opportunity I can find, and then going to the individuals or the companies involved to sort of fill in the blanks. So that does happen, but it happens for a really concrete reason, and a reason that we can't do a lot about, unfortunately.
It sounds like a real monetary reason.
It is a monetary reason. Because, as newspapers have lost their advertising base in print, they've got to get their advertisers online. And what advertisers online look for are how many clicks is your website getting. So, the more clicks, the more money they make in advertising. And so the more negative the stories become. Do
we still have editors, Laura, that look over what their reporters are doing and saying, yeah, this is good, run with it. No, we can't do this. Or do we have a bunch of, siloed reporters who are kind of doing their own thing?
Depends on the publication. The top tier publications, New York Times, Washington Post, absolutely, they have editors. The editors really are doing their due diligence and looking over the stories. I will say, I know a number of those editors. I'm related to one of those editors. And what they say is the process of editing has become so fast that they're editing things very, very quickly, much faster than they used to. So there is a time factor involved in that process that wasn't always there. I think everyone would agree it's become less thoughtful because of that. But then you have other publications that are using freelance reporters, interns. We had a major issue with a client, a negative story, and the byline was written by an investigative intern. I mean, I don't even know what that is in today's world. So you do deal with publications that are dealing with or contracting out to writers who either may be very young, maybe just writing for lots of different publications, or may not know anything about the industry they're writing about. And I do think in the case of community boards, unless you've served on one or unless you've lived in a community that has a board, there's a lot of misconceptions about how those boards work. And I think those misconceptions tend to get reflected in the media coverage.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And I also agree with your statement that it really is dependent on the outlet. I, as an English major at Northwestern, I appreciate a heavily edited article. And then I've seen articles just riddled with spelling errors, syntax problems. There was one, I get quoted fairly frequently over the years on association issues. One publication, like just to your point, I don't think they knew what a quorum was. I don't think they understood, how boards worked. When I read it, it was almost like it was run through a Google translator and it came out really messed up. So I think you're right on that. Are members of the media, Laura, are they bound by any sort of code of ethics?
They are. And I think for the most part, I've seen reporters try and follow those ethics. Now, remember, they're incentivized to write negative stories. So there's a fine line there. But one of the, constructs is that if they're going to quote you, mention you, if they're going to reference your organization, they have an obligation to reach out to you and let you know and give you the opportunity to comment. That generally happens. To your earlier point, that may happen with not a lot of advance warning, but that generally happens. There are some things that have shifted, though. We recently had a situation in which a key fact was left out of an article and it ran in the New York Times. And so we went to the New York Times and said, look, you guys are supposed to be, the upholders of all of this stuff. And there's a key fact missing. And what they told us was two things. They said, it's not our error because that's an Associated Press story. So even though it ran under their banner, they considered it not their responsibility to make that story correct. The other thing they said to us, which I thought was interesting, is that omission is not an error. And that used to not be the case. But they see now as factual omission does not constitute an error. And as you know, that can completely change a story.
What are they basing that on? What are they basing that shift on? That now an omission is not an error when an omission could be a huge error. It completely can skew the story.
I think it's that the story is skewed, but the facts within it are not necessarily wrong, which I think kind of dices, truth and accuracy too finely for my liking. But as the opinion is, as long as the facts that are on the page are not incorrect, then the story's not wrong. And if a fact's not included, it's not incorrect.
So I guess the moral of that story is you got to know the rules of engagement, and they've changed, and they're probably going to change more.
They're continuing to change. They are. Yeah, I think having someone experienced by your side for these things is really helpful. And I know a lot of, boards and community associations can't afford to go hire a PR agency, but there are probably people in the community that have some experience, former journalists, people who've worked in the media, communications people who may have worked in-house for corporations. It's not a bad idea to figure out who those people in a community are and just, if not put them on the board, at least put them on standby that, hey, we may need your counsel along the way.
I think that's a great suggestion. Although I will tell you from experience that sometimes people tend to forget all their wonderful career background when they get on these boards. And where did all that knowledge go? Well, when we're talking about community association stories, they're usually human interest stories, right? It could be something as mundane as, the Help Me Howard down here where somebody contacts the media and says my parking space has been, taken from me, to something as serious as a, personal injury, a wrongful death. What do you think the role of the media is in telling these human interest stories?
What media looks for are two or three things. One, they look for stories where they can help solve an issue. So to your point, Help Me Howard and consumer journalism like that, consumer journalists are looking to step into a problem and solve it. So that's one way. The other thing they're looking for is something that affects lots of people. So is this something that poses a risk to other people in other communities? Is this something that needs to be addressed, not just for this association, but perhaps associations at large? So they're looking for those larger stories that affect a greater number of people. A story is always more likely to be picked up if you have a victim or, someone who has the perception of having been wronged. It's more likely to be picked up if there are great visuals. I know we've all watched the news and seen some car chase and then realized it's, video from across the country, but it's on our local news. It's just because the video is compelling. And so, thinking about stories when you're contacted, it's important to understand all of the assets and content that might go into building that story, because it'll give you an indication as to how viable it is in terms of coverage.
So I have a story I want to relate. I want to get your take on it. I represented an association. I was contacted by a reporter. It was a TV reporter. And the association, there had been a mix-up on an architectural issue in a unit. It was a multifamily building. These unit owners wanted to do something with their unit. It was a miscommunication between the manager and these owners. They contacted the reporter. As soon as they contacted the reporter, I hadn't known about it. I reached out to the board. The mistake was discovered, basically counseled them and said, hey, this is a mistake. Manager owned up to it. She actually paid out of pocket to fix half of the mistake. Told the reporter the story had not yet run. So the whole story was different, Laura, than what they had gone out there. They said, this is a woman. She's pregnant. She's crying. Her husband's the whole 9 yards. And so I tell the reporter, it's resolved. The matter's resolved. And of course, the manager did this. The story still ran without saying it had been resolved. Is that typical?
It's not typical, but it happens. And in that case, we typically go to the general manager of that station. We'll sometimes go to legal counsel for the station and say, look, this is egregious. This painted a factually incorrect picture. Sometimes we get good response on that. Sometimes we don't. Often we will ask that the story be taken down, that the story, be removed from websites. And honestly, I've been surprised at how often we've had success in doing that. But it does require that something like that happens, that there is a major omission, a major factual error, that the story is just in the face of everything wrong. It doesn't work when you're just like, I don't like how we were portrayed, or, if it's a minor thing. But we have had success asking, going above the reporter, so to speak.
I got the sense that they had taped it and they were we spent time taping this, so we're going to use it. It's good content. And as you said, these media outlets are running on, I guess, fairly thin margins, or they're scrambling for content. But it takes using somebody like you who may know the station manager to reach out and say, hey, your reporter really screwed up on this one. I do also get the feeling, having dealt with members of the media, and some are wonderful, but others, I get the feeling that there's a rush to judgment at times. And then there's a failure to follow up. There's some great stories in the press that we hear about all the time, and then we're left hanging almost, like it's a Netflix series, and we've got to when are we going to know what happened at the end of this?
Yeah. So there is a rush. I don't know that it's a rush to judgment, but it's a rush to publish. There is, value to being first, and there's value to having the scoop, and so there absolutely can be a rush to publish for something that's very timely, something that's very hot. Again, reporters want those clicks. So if a story is widely in the news, they want to get their share of that online attention. And so there is a rush. And, as I mentioned, the editing process has become much more time constrained. And so they are trying to move as fast as they can to get their content published and online. So I think that's certainly true. And with the follow-up, honestly, that may be because that story didn't perform well online. So they're not going to go back and do the second story. We use a range of software tools, but one of them can tell us how well a story is performing for a particular media outlet in terms of digital clicks. And so when we're looking at client stories, what we're doing is saying, this story performed well, so expect more like it. This one did not perform well, so don't go chasing this with other outlets or other places, because it's a non-starter in terms of the media coverage. So we can see that, but largely stories where you see, story after story after story, it's because it's performing well online and they're getting the clicks.
I wasn't actually going to ask you this, but now that we're talking about it, do some reporters have their eye on the Pulitzer Prize here? Tell us about that.
So the rules of the Pulitzer are a little vague. I think they're not exactly published, but one of the things we know is that the Pulitzer tends to go to media coverage, typically it's serialized, that creates a change. So often reporters who are chasing Pulitzers and think they have a story are putting pressure around an issue to try and create either legislative change, create change in, community standards, create change in, in this case, maybe zoning, whatever it is, that if they can point to the fact that this coverage created this change, they've got a better likelihood of securing the awards.
Well, that's good to know. So, Laura, you've touched on this already, but how do you teach your clients to be media savvy?
I think we do a lot of media training with them. We do a lot of conversations like this, like, look, understand the media environment, understand what the media's pressures are, the constraints within their working, so that you can understand when they come to you kind of what their world looks like. We do a lot of media training. There's a lot of great stuff online about media training. And it's really, when you're sitting down with the media, it's just having clarity on your key messages and just going back to those time and again. You cannot sit down with a member of the media without preparing. You've got to know what you're going to say, why you're going to say it, and just say it over and over and over again. It's not a conversation. And I think a lot of clients make the mistake of going into a dialogue with media, as if it were a conversation that could go down any number of paths, which is not what you want it to do.
I'm thinking of another client where they had a member of the board speaking to the media about an issue in the community, and that board member did not tell the rest of his board members that he was going to be doing this. And as a result, they were shocked to see him on the nightly news talking about their community with his conclusions. And it didn't turn out well for him. The overall assessment was, let's say, Roger is not speaking for all of us. So it didn't make him any friends amongst his fellow directors or amongst the members. I think the takeaway is you've got to have a protocol and you've got to talk to your board. You cannot make these unilateral decisions. Normally it's the president. The president normally thinks that he or she is the best person to be speaking on issues. He or she may not be the best person. It might be their attorney. It might be the manager. It might be the secretary or treasurer. It might be better not to say anything, circling back to your initial comments. But, certainly it warrants a discussion. As like you said, you don't need to be impulsive about it. It does require some deliberation.
We've seen that as well when a member of the board will speak to the press without telling the rest of the group. I think it is important to have a protocol. I also think it's important to engage legal counsel on these things. We work very closely with legal counsel in most cases, and I always feel better if we've had, the association's attorney has had a chance to understand our strategy, understand what we're recommending, and provide their insights, because it is a different point of view than communications. And I've seen it where communications can end up exacerbating or creating legal issues, and that's certainly never the intention. But you really need someone with a law degree to tell you, where those risks are.
Well, I was going to say that the stakes are so much higher when litigation is pending or threatened. So that's even another layer here when you're dealing with the media that if you're being quoted out there, it may come into play with regard to that resulting litigation. So something to think about.
We always say we want to win both in the court of law and the court of public opinion.
How easy is that to do, Laura?
It's possible. It's possible.
Well, listen, it's no surprise that there's diminished trust in the media, right? We've been hearing the words fake news now for years. Do you think that lack of trust is warranted?
I think there's lack of trust in institutions across the board. Media is certainly one of them. I think it is warranted to a degree because of the shift we've seen. I think we still hold media to a very high standard, and yet their world has completely changed. And largely because of human nature, we're looking for and absorbing those scandalous stories. And so that's what they're feeding back to us. So I think, there is a warranted distrust. Fake news is a significant problem. And it's only going to get worse with the rise of synthetic media, which is media that is either what we now would call a deep fake, or media that's generated by AI, which is already happening in some newsrooms. In some newsrooms, the transactional real estate stories are actually written by computer programs and not journalists.
Well, you just read my mind because I wanted to ask you about deep fakes. I don't know if you know the TV show Homeland, but Homeland ran that a couple years ago where, they had video and it was being shown on TV and it was simulated. How are you going to fight that, Laura Guitar?
The challenge with that is it comes down to media literacy among the people who are consuming media. And so I think it's going to be even more critically important to teach people how to be accurate consumers of media, how to be thoughtful consumers of media. Often, right now at least, a lot of those have tells. There are ways you can tell if something's fake. You were referencing the article with misspellings and things. Obviously, that's a key that there's perhaps something wrong with that article, that it's not being published by a credible outlet. And so I think it's going to be important to start teaching people media literacy in a whole different way, to be able to understand when they're looking at something that's true and understand when they're looking at something that's false.
Well, I think that's so important. We get training on cybersecurity, right? 40-minute video, you have to look. And now you can see when somebody is doing a phishing attack and if the email's a little off or, there's certain, like you said, there's certain tells. But I wonder, average people throughout the world, are they going to have time to undertake that kind of rigorous training to spot a deep fake, particularly as the AI gets more sophisticated in the coming years?
And it will. And I think it's not just the time. Do you want to take the time to do that? Do you have the desire to do that? If what you're consuming is reinforcing all of your values, reinforcing all of your beliefs, reinforcing the kind of content you want to absorb, at that point, you're not inclined to say, well, maybe this is fake. You might look at things that don't reinforce your worldview more closely to see if they're real. But it's not in human nature to critically analyze something that agrees with us.
And look, the media has been under attack unfairly, in my opinion, over the years. Is the industry still attracting the best and the brightest, or are there some serious concerns?
I think there are people who are very committed to the ideal of journalism, to what journalism stands for as the fourth estate, as, making sure there are checks on power, making sure there is somebody, going through the, detailed court files or, the government notes. I think there are people who find that very appealing. It doesn't pay as well as it used to. It's a tough industry. But I do think there are, people who have, sort of that still hold that idealistic view of journalism and want to contribute to that legacy that it has played in our lives.
And it's important. I mean, even what we're seeing with the war correspondents in Ukraine, how do we, as the average person out here, know what's really going on unless there's somebody willing to go out there and tell us that story? So every campaign is different in crisis management, but is that something that the average community could afford to engage you on if it's a big story?
There are lots of levels of engagement. Very often we'll get a call from someone who's found us and said, here's what we're dealing with, and we have no budget. I am always happy to sit on the phone with someone for half an hour and say, tell me what's going on and I'll give you my best counsel. So there's always the opportunity to reach out and say, we can't afford you, but can you just point us in the right direction? Engagements vary. We do everything from helping with planning to helping with execution to serving as spokespersons. And a lot of communities don't need that entire spectrum of support. And so, some quick strategic planning at the beginning, some quick messaging at the beginning generally is enough to bridge successfully through the moment. And so it's, we or any other communications agency doesn't need to be engaged, necessarily at every step of the way unless it's something major.
And RBB puts resources out there on the internet, on your website. And
absolutely. We publish all kinds of blogs. We do all kinds of videos. There's good stuff online. It's pretty consistent. There's good communications publications that have lots of counsel. So a quick Google search matched up against compassion and, some thought is always a way to do it too.
And now there's this podcast episode, so they can get their episode listening to you. So Laura, last question. Is there anything I should have asked you and I didn't ask you about media relations and associations in this industry?
So I will add one more thing. A critical place where we see organizations of all kinds make an error in the early stages of engagement around an issue is they don't stop and ask the question, is this really my issue? So particularly for associations, they have large footprints, big buildings, big communities. Anything and everything under the sun can and does happen. But just because it happens proximate to your community or in your community doesn't necessarily mean it's your community's problem. And I'll give you kind of a macabre example of that. I used to work for a very large fast food chain in the country, and they would occasionally have dead bodies in their parking lot. And it's just because of the size of the organization. They didn't kill that person. That person wasn't affiliated with them. Somebody had dumped the bodies. We never commented on that. It was a crisis, and it was certainly tragic, but it wasn't our crisis, if that makes sense. Another example I'll give you real quick is in South Carolina, the Fish and Wildlife Commission decided to remove some invasive geese from a community. And the media got blown up with phone calls from community members who said, I don't understand why they're removing these geese, and this is terrible. And, somebody's got to stop this. And so, of course, the association got a call that said, why are you removing these geese? The association wasn't. It was the Fish and Wildlife Commission. And so in that case, it's important not to engage because it's not your crisis.
That is a really good point. And you mentioned animals, and I started this episode out by quoting that man bites dog, dog versus dog bites man. But those are the stories, Laura, the emotional support animals, the feral cats, somebody shooting the iguanas in the community. You're absolutely right on that. So
what is the saying? Don't act with kids or animals. I would say don't push the media with animals. We had a missing dog story in Nashville with a client that went on for weeks. All of Nashville was trying to bring Buddy home. It's amazing how far those stories go in media, and it's because we click on them. People love their animals.
So you're telling us if we would stop clicking on the negative and start clicking on the positive, everybody has their homework. I know it's human nature. It's hard to do. Laura, I want to thank you for joining us today. You've given some great tips to everyone. And listen, for everybody listening, I hope you're only quoted positively on positive stories in the media. But if you're not, you have a little bit of advice here on what to do when you get that email or that phone call. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to follow and rate us on your favorite podcast platform or visit takeittotheboard.com for more ways to connect.